Tell me, Patriot, have you ever wondered how much humiliation a soul can endure before it learns to fight back? Out on the lonely Pennsylvania frontier, where the wind carries whispers of struggle and the promise of freedom, one girl walks unseen through the dust of Fort Miller. Eleanor Ellie Brooke, poor, quiet, overlooked. A carpenter's daughter with calloused hands and a dignity no officer can strip away. The militiamen look past her as if she were nothing more than a shadow fixing their fences, repairing their target frames, holding together a world that refuses to see her worth. Meanwhile, the English merchants and officers ride through the fort with polished boots and sharper tongues, mocking the colonists who dare dream of liberty. Their cold laughter stains the air, a reminder of the betrayal choking these lands. A reminder that some lives are considered cheap simply because they were born on the wrong side of a crown. But in the quiet corners where no one pays attention, a spark waits. A spark inside a girl everyone thinks is too small to matter. A girl who has known struggle, sacrifice, and the sting of being dismissed. A girl who may soon show the frontier what true courage looks like. Welcome, Patriots. If you're not subscribed yet, make sure you are, and leave your like to help our fight for freedom. All right then, now we can begin. Ellie felt the sting of their laughter long before the words reached her. It rolled through the yard like a cold wind, slicing, deeper than any blade. Private Henry Clive leaned back on his stool, boots propped on the table as if he owned the whole frontier. His smirk wide enough to reveal the contempt he carried for anyone poorer than himself. Jonah Brewer joined him, slapping the stock of a battered brown Bess as if it were some prized treasure. "Careful, boys," Henry mocked, his voice dripping with disdain. "The rusty Yankee girl might try to fix our muskets with mud and prayer." Their chuckles followed Ellie like shadows. She kept walking, shoulders squared, jaw tight. Dignity was all she had left. The English officers strolling nearby barely glanced in her direction, as though colonial women existed only to serve or be stepped over. That insult cut deeper than the jeers of the young militiamen. Those officers served a crown that saw her people as tools, as bodies to be taxed, used, forgotten. Ellie felt that truth burning inside her, a quiet spark of rebellion the world refused to notice. When she approached the cluttered table of muskets, Henry and Jonah shifted just enough to block her way. They grinned with a cruelty born from insecurity, boys desperate to feel power over someone weaker. "Go mend a chicken coop, Camp Mouse," Jonah said, leaning forward so close she could smell the stale ale on his breath. "This is men's work." Humiliation drowned her like icy river water. For a moment, she thought her voice would crack under the weight of their degradation. She bit it back. Endurance was its own kind of defiance. She'd known that since childhood, when survival depended on silence more than strength. But something inside her shifted, a small transformation she couldn't name, a decision forming in the marrow of her bones. She reached for a musket anyway. Her fingers brushed the dull metal, tracing the neglect the men were too arrogant to see. The weapon was poorly cleaned, the barrel scratched, the lock plate loose, a careless flaw that could cost a patriot his life. Ellie knew this truth because she'd repaired rifles since she was old enough to lift one. Henry slapped her hand away. Not hard, hard enough. "I said move, girl." The insult burned, but beneath the shame rose another feeling. Anger, not wild, not reckless. A controlled fire born from every slight, every dismissal, every betrayal her people had endured under British arrogance. She looked at Henry, really looked, and saw a boy drunk on borrowed authority, a pawn trying to imitate the officers he admired. "You treat your weapons as poorly as your own dignity," she whispered. The words weren't loud, but they landed like a strike. Henry's face reddened. Jonah stood, fists clenching. The air tightened, ready to snap. The English officers paused nearby, amused by the tension. They loved nothing more than colonists turning on each other. Division made their rule easier. Ellie felt their gaze, their pleasure in her disgrace, and she understood then that this was no simple moment of mockery. This was part of a larger struggle, a quiet war waged long before any musket fired, a war against the slow suffocation of her people's independence. She stepped back before the boys could react, heart pounding. She wouldn't win this battle here, not yet. But she carried with her a revelation, that refusing to bow was its own form of liberty, and somewhere in the harsh frontier wind, she sensed her journey was shifting towards something she did not yet fully understand. The shame of this day would not be the end of her. It would be the beginning. Ellie moved through the camp like a muted echo, seen yet unnoticed, carrying her tools and her silence with the same steady grip. The laughter of the young militiamen still clung to her skin, a lingering insult that threatened to pull her back into disgrace, but she refused to let their contempt hollow her. Instead, she watched, quiet, patient, sharpened by indignity. At the weapons table, Henry and Jonah boasted about their skills, bragging loudly enough for the English officers nearby to hear. They hoped to impress men who saw them as nothing more than colonial farm boys playing at war. Ellie caught the sneers of those wealthy officers, noted the gleam of polished boots, the smirks carved into faces that had never felt real struggle. Their disdain hung in the air like smoke, thick and poisonous. While the men preened, Ellie's gaze moved with precision. Loose frisons, warped stocks, springs worn down to dangerous weakness. These weren't minor flaws. They were threats to any patriot forced to rely on them. A misfire, a jammed lock, a shattered stock, any one of them could steal a life on the frontier. She saw every flaw as clearly as if they were lit by fire. Brewer lifted a pistol to show off, fingers fumbling near the cock. Ellie saw the angle, the tension, the silent warning buried in the metal. A heartbeat later, the lock lurched, nearly snapping forward in a half-spark that could have torn flesh. Brewer jumped back, swearing, blaming the cold, the wood, anything but his own ignorance. Ellie said nothing, no gasp, no warning, no offer to help. She simply stepped aside, pretending she hadn't noticed the near disaster. It was easier to remain invisible than endure more mockery. Yet beneath the quiet, something heavier stirred, a revelation wrapped in disappointment. These were the men who claimed to defend independence, men who snarled at a woman's skill but couldn't see the hidden truths. Carved into their own rifles, she felt a bitter ache in her chest, a sense of betrayal deeper than the insults thrown at her. They fought for liberty, yet failed to respect the people beside them. Her silence wasn't cowardice, it was a decision, a shield, a way to survive the degradation surrounding her. But inside, rebellion simmered. Every flaw she saw, every insult she endured, every careless gesture from an English officer forged her transformation. She was no longer just the girl in the shadows. She was a witness to their mistakes, a guardian of unspoken knowledge, a quiet heartbeat in a growing storm. Ellie turned away from the table, carrying with her the weight of what she knew, and the weight of what she could no longer ignore, as her journey deepened into something far greater than sorrow. The broken pulley hung over the training range like a dead limb, swaying uselessly in the wind. For months it had mocked the militia's efforts, leaving the men to reset targets by hand, wasting time, patience, and what little dignity they still held under British scorn. Blacksmith Thomas Greeley had hammered at it until his arms shook. 2 wheelwrights tore it apart and rebuilt it twice. Another craftsman cursed it until he lost his voice. All of them failed, and each failure fed the English officers' sneers, their whispers of colonial incompetence drifting across the yard like poison. When the captain barked for answers, the men stood frozen. Their pride was already wounded. Admitting defeat before the English would grind it further into disgrace. Thomas stepped forward, defeated, muttering that the contraption was beyond salvation. The officers laughed under their breath, amused by the misery of simple colonists. Ellie felt the sting of that ridicule settle over the camp, heavy as smoke. She stepped out from the shadow of the fence, quiet as snowfall, not seeking praise, not seeking recognition, only driven by a restless pull inside her, a need to protect the independence her people still clung to. She approached the tangled ropes and warped wheels, ignoring the startled murmurs of the men who had mocked her hours earlier. They stared as if a ghost had wandered into their midst. Ellie knelt, fingers tracing the lines of tension and friction, absorbing their secrets the way others read scripture. A loose anchor bolt, a misaligned spindle, a worn groove that could be repurposed if weighted properly. Small truths everyone else had missed. She pulled a thin awl from her belt, a nail from her pocket, and a scrap of leather used for binding musket stocks. Improvised tools for an improvised world. In minutes, metal clicked into harmony. Ropes tightened, wheels shifted. The mechanism shuddered once, then rolled with smooth precision. The targets danced upright in perfect sequence, as if awakened from a long sleep. Silence swept the training range. Not admiration, not gratitude. Shock. The English officers' smirks vanished for a heartbeat before, returning sharper, colder, threatened by the idea that a colonial girl could accomplish what trained men could not. The militiamen stared with a strange mix of awe and shame, ashamed that they had failed, ashamed that their pride had made them blind, ashamed that the one they dismissed as worthless had restored something they believed lost. Ellie rose without triumph. She didn't need applause. The revelation carved inside her was enough. A hidden truth unveiled by her own hands. The fight for liberty was not only waged with muskets or blood. Sometimes it lived in quiet acts of defiance, in decisions made beneath the weight of contempt, in the transformation of a single moment when a forgotten soul refused to remain small. She dusted her palms and stepped back as the pulley spun freely, each rotation echoing a promise she didn't yet understand. Her journey was shifting again, drawing her toward a fate she had never imagined, shaped by skills no one believed she possessed. Caleb North had been watching her long before anyone realized he was paying attention. The veteran stood at the edge of the range, leaning on a cane carved from old hickory, his weathered face cut by scars that told their own stories of sacrifice and survival. He had fought through smoke and blood in the French and Indian War, had buried friends in frozen soil, had seen too many boys crumble under pressure. He knew the trembling hands of fear. He knew the clumsy grip of inexperience. And he knew with absolute certainty that Ellie Brooke possessed neither. What he saw in her movements was something far rarer, the instinct of someone who had learned under threat, shaped by necessity, hardened by a journey most people never returned from. Her fingers worked with quiet authority, guided by revelations earned through hardship. She handled tools the way seasoned soldiers handled rifles, with an understanding deeper than training. It unsettled him. It impressed him. It made him question everything the fort assumed about the girl in the shadows. When the pulley snapped back to life and the crowd's disbelief settled into uneasy silence, Caleb approached her, not with swagger, not with entitlement, with respect, a dignity only a man who had lost much could offer. "You've done what no one else here could," he said, voice low, steady. "That kind of precision, that's forged under fire, not taught in a workshop." Ellie didn't flinch, didn't boast. Her eyes stayed fixed on the ground, as if revealing too much would strip away the small independence she still held. "Just fixing what needed fixing," she replied. "That's not an answer," Caleb murmured. She finally met his gaze. In her eyes he saw sorrow, grit, and something even heavier, a hidden truth she carried alone, a past she guarded like a secret wound. "On the road," she said softly, "fixing what needed fixing." It was barely an explanation, yet the weight behind it made Caleb's breath tighten. He knew roads filled with smoke, roads lined with graves, roads where children grew old too fast, and women learned to mend weapons because no one else survived long enough to teach them. The militiamen kept their distance now, uncertain, ashamed, confused by the transformation unfolding before them. Their earlier insults felt small, almost childish, when placed beside the quiet strength they had mocked. The English officers, however, watched Ellie with a colder interest. Their arrogance remained, but beneath it lurked something new, irritation, a colonial girl who solved problems they could not. It unsettled their sense of superiority. It chipped at the illusion of British perfection. Caleb sensed their disdain and stepped closer to Ellie, placing himself subtly between her and the officer's gaze. "People see only what they want to see," he whispered, "but some of us see what others refuse." Ellie lowered her eyes again, not out of shame, but in an effort to protect herself from the questions she wasn't ready to answer. The road she had traveled carried shadows she didn't dare bring into the open. Not yet. But with every passing moment, with every small act of defiance, she felt the walls around her beginning to shift. Decisions long avoided pressed at the edges of her thoughts. Her journey towards something irreversible was no longer distant. It had already begun. The Charleville arrived slung over a rider's shoulder, wrapped in burlap as if it were a corpse. The moment it hit the table, even the seasoned craftsman stepped back. Its lock assembly was shattered, the barrel dented, the pan warped beyond recognition. This wasn't a simple crack or worn spring. It was the kind of wound only a true armorer could read, the kind born on battlefields where smoke blinded men and desperate hands pushed weapons past their limits. The militiaman muttered that it was useless, another reminder of colonial weakness, another symbol of how far beneath the English they stood. An officer, passing by, glanced at the broken weapon and smirked, mumbling that the colonists couldn't even keep their guns alive. The insults spread through the camp like ash, settling on every poor farmer and tired soldier who had already sacrificed too much to stomach such contempt. Caleb North said nothing to the officer. His eyes were fixed on Ellie. He stepped forward, laying a hand on the musket as if preparing a delicate offering. "Bring it to her," he ordered quietly. Henry Clive scoffed. Jonah Brewer rolled his eyes. "She's not an armorer," Henry snapped. "She's barely a carpenter." Caleb didn't argue. He simply lifted the musket and carried it to Ellie himself. She said nothing at first. She stood in the cold morning light, hands still stained with dust from the repaired pulley, hair brushed by the wind like strands of dark smoke. When Caleb set the Charleville before her, she hesitated, not out of fear, but recognition. A hidden truth stirred in her expression, something more than memory, deeper than skill. Her fingers touched the barrel with the gentleness one reserves for an old friend. She traced every dent, every fracture, every sign of desperation. Her face changed, a subtle shift but unmistakable, grief interwoven with understanding. She turned the weapon over, examining the French steel as though it carried a story only she could hear. The camp fell silent around her. The boys who mocked her watched with unease, their earlier arrogance dissolving into uncertainty. Even the English officers paused, sensing something they couldn't explain. A colonial girl holding a weapon with a mastery that challenged their assumptions. Their disdain wavered, turning into something darker, more dangerous. Threatened pride. Ellie slid her thumb across the ruined lock plate. She tested the pan, listened to the hollow click of the fractured springs. She inhaled slowly, as if the scent of burnt powder and old battles still lingered there. The transformation in her eyes unsettled Caleb. It was not the gaze of a simple craftswoman. It was the gaze of someone who had walked roads marked by betrayal and survival, someone who had witnessed how quickly life could be torn apart when a weapon failed at the wrong second. "This musket was pushed past its limit," she murmured, "fired when it should have been rested, cleaned in the dark, forced to do more than it could bear." Her voice softened, carrying a quiet sorrow. Someone fought hard with it. Caleb nodded, understanding more than she realized. Can you repair it? Ellie looked up. The answer lived behind her eyes. The revelation that she knew these mechanisms too intimately for someone untrained, that her past held shadows she never spoke of. She didn't say yes. She didn't say no. She simply held the Charleville closer, as if its scars echoed her own. I can try, she whispered. Yet behind the words lay a deeper truth. Fixing this musket would change her path. It was no longer about tools or pride. It was about choosing a side in a struggle that had already claimed too many lives, a decision that would mark the next step of her journey towards something irreversible. Ellie laid the Charleville on the workbench with a care that felt almost ceremonial, as if she were preparing a fallen soldier for burial. The morning air carried a sharp chill, but her hands moved with absolute steadiness. She lifted the musket, turned it once to feel its weight, then began to open it with a precision that did not belong to a simple carpenter's daughter. Metal responded to her touch like it recognized her. Screws loosened without protest. Pins slid free. Plates separated in clean, confident motions. Caleb North watched, breath caught in his throat. He had seen these movements before, long ago. In the border wars, when covert scout units moved like shadows through forests soaked in blood and fog, there had been a rumor, a ghost of the frontier, an unnamed armorer who traveled with elite skirmishers, someone who repaired weapons in darkness under fire with an efficiency no ordinary craftsman possessed. No one knew their face, no one knew their real name. Just the legend of hands that never trembled, hands that saved men's lives without ever stepping onto a battlefield as anything but a whisper. Ellie Brooke moved with that same deadly grace. She removed the lock assembly in one fluid motion. Caleb's scarred jaw tightened. She pried out the cracked sear spring not with force, but with the subtle pressure of someone who understood exactly how much strength the steel could tolerate. She inspected the shattered frizzen and the warped pan, turning them in her fingers as though listening for murmurs only she could hear. The militiamen stared, confused, uneasy. Henry swallowed hard. Jonah's face paled. Their earlier insults felt childish now, crushed under the weight of a truth they couldn't name. Even the English officers stopped pretending they weren't watching. Their expressions sharpened. Irritation, suspicion, a flicker of something close to fear. The idea that a colonial girl possessed mastery they could not explain struck them as a direct affront to their supposed superiority. Ellie worked on, unaware of the storm gathering around her. Each piece she removed revealed another layer of hidden knowledge. She mapped fractures with her fingertips. She traced stress lines along the barrel. Her eyes narrowed with understanding born from more than technical skill. It was survival, memory, a past soaked in sacrifice and silence. Caleb felt a chill crawl down his spine. The transformation unfolding before him was no coincidence. This was not the result of simple talent. This was training carved into a child by fire and desperation. A revelation clawed at the edge of his mind, one he wasn't sure he had the right to voice. Ellie set the cracked spring aside, exhaling softly. This musket wasn't broken in one moment, she said. It failed in stages, pushed too far, neglected too long, then forced to fight anyway. Her words carried more than mechanical analysis. They held the sorrow of someone who had walked beside men carrying dying rifles, someone who had seen what happened when a weapon failed at the wrong second, someone who had borne that guilt alone. Caleb stepped closer, voice strained. "Who taught you this?" Ellie didn't answer immediately. Her gaze stayed fixed on the scattered parts, on the wounded steel that mirrored her own past. She looked like a soul torn between revealing a truth and protecting whatever remained of it. "I learned because I had to," she finally whispered, "because no one else remained." The silence that followed was heavy, unsettling. It marked the beginning of a shift none of them fully understood yet. The moment Ellie Brooke stopped being a girl in the shadows and became something far more dangerous. Abel Harding had spent 3 decades tending muskets, repairing locks, and watching green. Soldiers die with weapons they barely understood. He knew the smell of danger better than any officer in Fort Miller. And when Ellie Brooke dismantled that Charleville with the precision of a battlefield surgeon, something inside him twisted. Curiosity first, then unease, then fear. He went to the records room under the excuse of routine verification. The clerks barely looked up. No one cared about paperwork unless it involved rations or punishment. Abel lit a lantern, its glow revealing rows of aging ledgers and tattered folders, dignity carved into ink and dust. He found Ellie's file easily because there was almost nothing in it. A hiring slip with a single sentence. Carpenter's assistant. No past residence. No family references. No travel routes. Just a name and a signature too steady for a girl supposedly raised in backwoods poverty. That emptiness chilled him more than a detailed history ever could. Suspicion gnawed at him. He unlocked the restricted chest containing sealed correspondence from Philadelphia and the Committee of Safety. Only captains and senior craftsmen were allowed access, but Abel had been around long enough to know the system's weaknesses. He sifted through folded orders, stamped decrees, warnings about British movements. Nothing unusual until he found it. A sealed envelope, thin, marked with a sigil he had only seen twice in his life. A crescent blade surrounded by laurel. The sign of the covert auxiliaries used during the border wars, units the Crown claimed never existed, and the colonies pretended to forget. His heart hammered as he unfolded the slip inside. Subject Brooke, former auxiliary of frontier covert operations. Do not question. Do not contact past superiors. The words stabbed like ice. He read it again, slower. Each line felt like a revelation he had no right to witness. A hidden truth buried beneath layers of political denial and whispered stories shared around dying campfires. Auxiliaries weren't soldiers. They were shadows forged from necessity, orphans, runaways, survivors shaped by violence and secrecy. People taught to mend rifles under fire and disappear before dawn. Dangerous tools used by commanders who valued results more than humanity. Ellie Brooke had been one of them. Abel's breath shook. Shame crept up his spine. He had laughed with the others when she passed. He had overlooked her, dismissed her, allowed the disgrace she endured to stain her every step. A girl molded by war, yet treated like dirt by those she could save. He reached for the envelope again, just as a courier burst into the room. Orders from Philadelphia. Urgent, non-negotiable. Abel broke the seal. His eyes widened. All inquiries regarding Subject Brooke must cease immediately. Destroy all investigative materials. Report no further. He felt the weight of political chains tightening around him. He wasn't supposed to know. No one was. Ellie's past was meant to stay buried beneath her silence, hidden for reasons far beyond rank or pride. Outside, the fort hummed with routine misery, soldiers drilling with faulty muskets, English officers sneering at colonial incompetence, farmers praying the Crown would ignore them one more day. And through it all, Ellie worked in the shadows, unaware that her history had been dragged back into the light by a man trembling with the knowledge he was never meant to hold. Abel closed the chest and extinguished the lantern, his hands unsteady. One truth burned in him now. The road Ellie had walked was far darker than anyone suspected, and whatever her journey had been, it was not finished. Respect did not arrive in a burst. It seeped into the fort like dawn through cracks in a shutter, slow, reluctant, unavoidable. First came silence, then curiosity, then the smallest signs of surrender from those who once drowned Ellie in disgrace. Henry Clive was the first to change. He left his musket on her bench without a word, pretending he had simply misplaced it. Jonah followed the next morning, dropping off a pistol with a warped jawspring, avoiding her eyes as if looking at her meant admitting shame. Others followed. Farmers drafted into militia duty, boys whose hands shook during inspection, worn-out fathers who feared leaving their children behind. They came not with pride, but with something deeper, trust earned through sacrifice. The English officers noticed, of course. Their contempt sharpened. They whispered that colonists were pathetic enough to rely on a girl to save them. Their smirks tried to poison the air, but the mood shifted. The militia began to feel something dangerous: confidence. Ellie's quiet mastery became a lifeline, a thread holding together their fragile sense of independence. Before a long expedition upriver, Caleb arrived at her workbench with a musket that seemed beyond hope. The alignment was so warped it should have been retired. He held it out not as a test, but as a plea. "If this fails," he said softly, "men will die." Ellie nodded once. She didn't promise anything. She didn't need to. She set to work, dismantling the weapon with swift, precise movements that carried the weight of memory. Her hands mapped the weapon's injuries, understanding them the way a doctor interprets pulse and ragged breath. She shaved a sliver of wood, heated the barrel just enough to coax it back into shape, improvised a brace from scrap iron. Every motion reflected an unspoken willingness to shoulder the burdens of men who had never carried hers. In less than an hour, the musket clicked back together with perfect alignment. Caleb tested the action: smooth, clean, reliable. He didn't thank her with words. He simply placed a hand over his heart, a gesture of dignity a soldier offers only to someone who has earned a place in his survival. Days later, deep in the wilderness north of the river, that musket saved his life. A hidden British scout fired first, shattering the tree beside Caleb. His return shot was instinctive, deadly, a single spark of rebellion piercing the gloom. The weapon didn't falter. It didn't misfire. It obeyed Ellie's craftsmanship with flawless loyalty. Caleb survived because of her hands. Hands the English despised, hands the militia once mocked, hands shaped by a journey none of them understood. When the patrol returned, bruised and thinner, something unspoken rippled through the camp. Men who once laughed at Ellie now removed their hats as she passed, not out of pity, out of reverence, out of recognition that her skill, her silence, her endurance were acts of defiance in a world determined to grind down the powerless. Ellie felt the shift, but she didn't bask in it. Respect was never her goal. It was merely a shadow cast by the truth she carried, a truth that was becoming harder to keep buried. And like all buried truths, it was beginning to demand a reckoning. Ellie stood alone at the edge of Fort Miller as winter crept across the frontier, its breath cold enough to bite through wool and bone. The militia trained in the yard, their movements sharper now, their weapons truer, each man carrying a piece of her quiet labor without ever fully understanding the sacrifice behind it. They whispered of independence in the dim light of the tavern. They spoke of rebellion in hushed tones near the riverbank, glancing over their shoulders as if the very trees might betray them. The world was shifting, a storm was rising, and Ellie Brooke felt every tremor of it in the steel she repaired and the powder she measured by hand. No one in the fort knew the full truth of her path, only fragments scattered like embers from a dying campfire. They knew nothing of the roads she had walked, the covert scouts she had once served, the long nights repairing rifles for men who never made it to dawn. They didn't know how many times she had carried the burden of another soldier's survival in the hollow of her hands. They didn't know how often she had endured disgrace, insult, and indifference just to keep the flame of liberty alive a little longer. But Caleb North understood, and Abel Harding, though bound by secrecy, bowed his head now whenever Ellie passed, as if acknowledging a debt that could never be repaid. The English officers still sneered, unable to fathom how a girl they considered insignificant had become the quiet heart of the fort's endurance. Their contempt meant nothing to her now. She had outgrown the degradation they tried to chain her with. Her strength no longer came from recognition, but from conviction, from a calling older than war itself. Ellie never asked for thanks. She never sought glory. Instead, she repaired muskets until her fingers bled, shaped iron until her palms burned, and mended tools long after the others slept. And when word arrived, soft, trembling, full of danger, that the colonies had risen, that the first sparks of uprising had ignited across the towns, Ellie's hands did not shake. She simply opened her toolbox and kept working. The first rifles fired by Patriots would carry her uncredited touch, her hidden craft, her unspoken loyalty, her quiet rebellion. That was her legacy, not a name etched in books, but lives saved, battles survived, and a cause strengthened by the hands no one ever thought to honor. When the militia marched out beneath the grey sky, Ellie watched them go with a steady gaze. She felt no pride, no triumph, only a solemn understanding that the journey ahead would demand sacrifice beyond measure. But she also felt something else, hope, a fragile, stubborn ember refusing to die. She had served in the shadows. She had endured degradation and betrayal, yet she never abandoned her people or their fragile dream of independence. Ellie Brooke, the ghost of the frontier, remained a patriot to her final breath, proving that true courage often walks unheard, unseen, but never unneeded. If you felt this story burn in your heart, let me know with a like and a comment, and if you wish to stand with these patriots in the battles still to come, you are welcome to join us by subscribing. Your support keeps this flame alive.